The grey light of dawn on June 6, 1944, broke over the Normandy coast with a deceptive stillness, masking the impending cataclysm that was about to alter the course of human history. Inside the reinforced concrete casemate of the Crisbecq battery, Oberleutnant Walter Ohmsen stood at his observation post, the cold dampness of the concrete seeping through his uniform. It was 5 a.m., and the world outside was a monochrome study in shadow and mist. Ohmsen, a hardened 32-year-old naval officer, gripped his binoculars with hands that betrayed a slight, involuntary tremor, not from fear, but from a growing, gnawing instinct that the silence was unnatural. For months, the German High Command had assured officers like him that the Atlantic Wall was impenetrable, a fortress of European engineering that would shatter any Allied attempt to breach the continent. They had been told that the enemy was weary, that their supply lines were overextended, and that the English Channel was a protective moat that served the Reich. As Ohmsen pressed his eyes to the lenses, peering through the lifting gloom, the physics of his reality shattered. The horizon, which should have been an empty expanse of grey water, had ceased to exist. In its place was a solid, darkening mass that stretched as far as the optical glass could see, a geometric impossibility of steel and smoke. What Ohmsen witnessed in that freezing pre-dawn moment was the absolute negation of every piece of propaganda he had absorbed over the last decade. The English Channel had been transformed into a steel highway, a paved road of vessels numbering nearly 7,000. It was an armada of such staggering proportions that the human mind struggled to catalogue the individual components. There were battleships with guns the size of factory chimneys, cruisers bristling with rapid-fire turrets, destroyers cutting through the swell like and thousands upon thousands of landing craft, flat-bottomed and ugly, designed for the sole purpose of disgorging an army onto his doorstep. The German intelligence estimates, which had calculated an invasion force of perhaps 20 divisions, supported by 3,000 ships, were rendered instantly laughable. This was not a military operation in the traditional sense. It was the migration of a continent's entire industrial output. The mathematics of defeat were sailing toward him at 8 knots, and as the realization settled in the pit of his stomach, Ohmsen understood that the war, in any meaningful strategic sense, was already over. At 5:52 a.m. The paralysis of awe gave way to the reflex of training. Ohmsen's battery received the order to open fire. The massive 210mm Coda cannons, checkmate beasts capable of hurling shells over 20 miles, roared to life 3 minutes later. The entire bunker complex shuddered as the first salvo arced high into the heavy air, destined for the massive shipping. To the German gunners, the act felt futile, akin to throwing pebbles at an incoming tidal wave. The battery engaged the heavy cruisers USS Tuscaloosa and USS Quincy, along with the battleship USS Nevada, in a display of tactical brilliance that would later be studied by naval historians. Ohmsen's guns managed to claim the destroyer USS Corey, stripping the vessel of its life and sending it to the bottom. Yet, even as they scored hits, the German crews watched in horror as the gap in the line was instantly filled. Ships were sinking, burning, and exploding, but the armada did not pause. It was a hydra, cut off one head, and the industrial capacity of the United States simply welded to more in its place. This was the first terrifying lesson of D-Day for the defenders. They were fighting an enemy that treated warships not as precious, irreplaceable jewels of the state, but as expendable tools of war, easily replaced from a bottomless inventory. 50 miles inland, at the headquarters of Army Group B in Laurent, the atmosphere was one of confusion and slowly dawning horror. Lieutenant General Hans Spittel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Owen Rommel, paced the stone floors of the chateau, piecing together fragments of frantic reports. The irony of the situation was bitter. Rommel, the Desert Fox, the man charged with defending the Atlantic Wall, was absent. He was in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday, lulled into a false sense of security by meteorologists who had predicted weather to foul for an amphibious assault. But the Allies had brought their own weather storm of steel. By 1:20 a.m., reports had flooded in regarding massive parachute drops. The sky over the Cotentin Peninsula was filled with the roar of Douglas C-47 Skytrains, delivering the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. General Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps from St. Louis, was one of the few who grasped the immediacy of the threat. A veteran of the Eastern Front with a wooden leg, Marx possessed a tactical intuition sharpened by years of brutal combat against the Soviets. He knew this was the main event. Yet, even Marx, with all his experience, could not conceptualize the logistical avalanche that was descending upon them. The German army had prepared to fight men. They were not prepared to fight the combined GDP of the free world. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge, Rommel's naval advisor, had spent the previous months inspecting the coastal defenses, obsessing over minefields and beach obstacles. He had walked the sands, calculating tides and angles of fire, believing that a clever defense could bleed the enemy white. But as the sun rose higher on June 6th, revealing the totality of the invasion fleet, Ruge realized the obsolescence of his preparations. He would later write with chilling clarity that the Germans were preparing to fight the last war, while the Allies had brought the next one. The German military machine was built on the concept of operational brilliance, of maneuvering limited resources with superior skill. The Allied machine was built on the concept of overwhelming material superiority, a blunt instrument of such weight that maneuver became irrelevant. The defenders were watching the collision of two eras, the waning age of martial romanticism and the dawning age of industrial annihilation. As the naval bombardment commenced at 5:30 a.m., the German defenders were introduced to the violent reality of American industrial mathematics. The fleet unleashed a hurricane of ordnance that defied description. The USS Texas alone, a veteran battleship of a previous era, fired 255 rounds from her 14-inch guns in the first hour. Each of those shells weighed nearly 1,400 pounds. In 60 minutes, a single ship delivered 178 tons of high explosives onto German positions, more firepower than many German artillery regiments possessed in their entire ammunition reserves. The ground shook with a continuous, sickening vibration that liquefied the organs of men hiding in bunkers. Concrete pillboxes, reinforced with feet of steel and stone, were cracked open like eggshells before a single infantryman's boot touched the sand. The Allied naval forces had expended roughly 130,000 tons of explosive ordnance. General der Infanterie Gunther Blumentritt would later testify that they had expected a battle against soldiers but found themselves fighting factories. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and pulverized limestone, a sensory overload that drove men to madness before they ever saw an enemy rifle. Then came the aircraft. At 6 a.m., as the naval shelling reached its crescendo, the sky darkened with a second wave of industrial might. The Allies had secured total air supremacy, a fact that the German soldier on the ground felt with every terrified breath. The Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties on D-Day alone. In contrast, the once mighty Luftwaffe, now a shadow of the force that had terrorized Europe in 1940, managed a pitiful 319 sorties across the entire front. For every single German plane that dared to take to the sky, there were 46 Allied aircraft waiting to hunt it down. The disparity was absurd, a grim joke played on the pilots of the Third Reich. The famous sortie of Major Joseph Priller and his wingman Heinz Waderchi, who strafed Swordbeach in their Focke-Wulf 190s, became legendary not for its effectiveness, but for its pathetic isolation. They were two gnats buzzing against the swarm of eagles. The German soldiers looking up from their foxholes realized then that the sky belonged to the enemy, and with it, the ability to move, to resupply, and to survive. Despite this apocalyptic bombardment, the German infantry at certain strongholds held their ground with a tenacity that surprised the invaders. At Omaha Beach, the 352nd Infantry Division, a unit combat-hardened from the Eastern Front, occupied the bluffs. Their positions were well sighted, with MG-42 machine guns creating interlocking fields of fire that turned the beach into a kill zone. When the ramps of the landing craft dropped at 6:30 a.m., the Americans walked into a slaughter. Heinrich Severloh, a young soldier manning a machine gun at Weiter Stansness 62, became the embodiment of the German defensive effort. In a trance-like state of horror and duty, he fired over 12,000 rounds that morning, the barrel of his weapon glowing red-hot, necessitating constant changes. He watched as the surf turned crimson, bodies piling up in the water until they acted as grim sandbags for the living. For a few precarious hours, it seemed that the Atlantic Wall might actually hold, that the sheer ferocity of the German soldier could turn back the tide of industry. But the Allies had a solution for tactical stalemate: more steel. Around 8 a.m., with the invasion at Omaha teetering on the brink of disaster, the American Navy did something unprecedented. Destroyers like the USS McCook, USS Crisbecq, and USS Doyle broke formation and steamed directly toward the shore, scraping their keels on the sandbars. They closed to within 1,000 yards point-blank range for naval gunnery, ignoring the risk of mines and shore batteries. They turned their 5-inch guns onto the individual bunkers that were pinning down the infantry. The accuracy was surgical. The devastation was absolute. German commanders watching through their periscopes were stunned by the aggression. They were witnessing a navy that was willing to risk capital ships to save infantry squads. It was a demonstration of resource abundance that the German mind could barely comprehend. When the USS Corey was sunk during these duels, the Allied line did not falter. Other ships simply stepped over her grave to continue the bombardment. The lesson was hammered home with high explosives. Courage could not stop a destroyer. As the sun climbed higher, the true scale of the amphibious operation revealed itself in the endless conveyor belt of specialized machinery reaching the shore. The Germans were astounded by the variety of vessels, each designed to solve a specific logistical problem. There were landing craft tank LCTs that drove 30-ton Sherman tanks directly onto the sand, and massive landing ship tanks LSTs, 300 feet long, opening their bow doors to vomit entire armored companies. Most baffling of all were the DUKW amphibious trucks, strange hybrids of boat and truck that swam through the waves and drove up the dunes, ferrying supplies directly to the front lines without pausing. By nightfall, the Allies had landed approximately 156,000 troops and 20,000 vehicles. This single day's delivery exceeded the strength of the entire German 7th Army defending the region. The Germans possessed fewer than 500 operational tanks in the entire theater. The Allies landed 3 times that number in the first 24 hours. It was a logistical miracle that rendered the German concept of defensive warfare obsolete. The German response to this invasion was a tragic study in systemic breakdown. The legendary panzer divisions, the iron fist of the Wehrmacht, were paralyzed. The complex command structure, requiring Hitler's personal authorization to release the reserves, froze the tanks in place during the critical early hours. When the 21st Panzer Division finally began its counterattack late in the afternoon, moving from near Cannes, they discovered that the battlefield had changed fundamentally since their triumphs in 1940. Allied fighter bombers, the dreaded Jabos, prowled the skies, pouncing on any vehicle that kicked up dust. The movement of the division was a crawl, punctuated by burning steel. When they finally engaged British forces near Sword Beach, they ran into a wall of naval gunfire directed by forward observers. The HMS Warspite, sitting comfortably miles offshore, dropped 15-inch shells onto the tank columns, cracking the heavy armor of the panzers like tin cans. SS Standartenfer Kurt Meyer would later reflect that their strength was swept away like a wave breaking on a rock. The tactical superiority of the German tank crews was nullified by an enemy that could call down the wrath of a battleship on a single platoon. On the days following the invasion, German reconnaissance aircraft brought back photographs that were initially dismissed as forgeries or errors by the intelligence staff. The images showed the Allies building harbors in the open sea. The Mulberry harbors were an engineering feat, so audacious that the German High Command had never considered it a possibility. Prefabricated in Britain and towed across the Channel, these artificial ports consisted of massive concrete caissons, floating roadways, and sunken ships acting as brakes. Within 2 weeks, these pop-up ports were handling 9,000 tons of supplies daily. The Germans had spent 4 years fortifying the major French ports, assuming the Allies would need to capture one to sustain an offensive. The Allies simply brought their own ports with them. It was a masterstroke of industrial capability that bypassed the entire strategic logic of the Atlantic Wall. The Germans were playing chess. The Allies were redesigning the board. Throughout June and July, the realization of the intelligence failure deepened. The Germans had been duped by Operation Fortitude, a massive deception campaign that convinced them that Normandy landings were merely a feint and that the real invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, led by the fictitious 1st United States Army Group under General Patton. This belief was so entrenched that crucial German reserves remained frozen in Calais for weeks, waiting for a ghost army while the real war raged in Normandy. When General Leopold von Schweppenberg finally realized the truth, that Patton was actually in Normandy commanding the very real Third Army, it was too late. The deception was not just a triumph of it was a triumph of resources. The Allies could afford to equip a fake army with inflatable tanks and fake radio. traffic on a scale that rivaled the actual German army. As the weeks ground on, the reports from the front to the German High Command turned from concerned to desperate. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, a man of the old Prussian school, saw the writing on the wall. When Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel called from Berlin, demanding to know how to save the situation, Rundstedt's reply was a concise epitaph for the Third Reich: "Make peace, you fools. What else can you do?" He was relieved of command for his candor, but his assessment was mathematically precise. Rommel, too, tried to break through Hitler's delusions. In a meeting on June 17th, he presented the Führer with the cold, hard statistics of their doom: total Allied air supremacy, German divisions grinded down to 30% strength, and the impossibility of daylight movement. Hitler's response was a furious demand for fanaticism, a command to hold every inch of ground. Rommel left the meeting knowing that Germany was being led by a man fighting a war of fantasy, divorced from the industrial reality of 1944. The culmination of this material disparity was the annihilation of the German forces in the Falaise Pocket. In August, Operation Cobra, the American breakout, began with a display of air power that resembled a natural disaster. 1,500 heavy bombers turned a section of the front into a lunar landscape, carpet bombing an area just a few miles wide. General Fritz Bayerlein of the Panzerlehr Division, positioned directly under the flight path, watched as his elite unit was erased from existence. Tanks were flipped upside down by the shockwaves. Men were buried alive in their foxholes. Bayerlein reported that his division was not fighting an army, but an industrial complex. The subsequent encirclement at Falaise was a graveyard for the Wehrmacht in the west. The roads were choked with the wreckage of thousands of vehicles, a corridor of death, where Allied aircraft strafed the retreating columns with impunity. The smell of decaying bodies and horse carcasses, thousands of horses, revealing the lack of German mechanization, permeated the countryside. The statistics of the campaign painted a picture of hopeless struggle. By 1944, the United States was producing 96,000 aircraft a year. Germany, under constant bombing, managed nearly 40,000, but had no fuel to fly them, and no pilots to fly them. The US produced 29,000 tanks to Germany's peak of roughly 18,000. But the most telling statistic was the truck. The Americans produced over 600,000 military trucks in 1944. Germany produced 68,000. The Wehrmacht was still largely a horse-drawn army, trying to maneuver against a fully mechanized force. General Franz Halder later calculated that the Allied production advantage was 5-1, and in logistics, 10-1. They were not defeated. They were mathematically eliminated. For the German officers who survived, the psychological impact was profound. They had grown up under a regime that preached the superiority of the German will and the weakness of the mongrel democratic nations. Normandy shattered that worldview. They saw that the Americans were not soft, they were efficient. They saw that democracy could harness industrial power on a scale that totalitarianism could not match. They watched young American GIs, supposedly spoiled by luxury, fight with a confidence born of unlimited ammunition and support. The suicide rate among German officers spiked, not just from the shame of defeat, but from the collapse of their reality. They realized that the 1,000-year Reich was being dismantled by Ford and General Motors.